The port of Acre teemed with life and tension during the last years of the 12th century. Its docks were crowded with Italian merchants, exhausted crusaders, sick pilgrims and monks tending to the wounded arriving from the city walls. It was one of the last Christian strongholds in the Holy Land and, as such, a precarious refuge where war and faith coexisted in an unstable balance. It was in this setting that the brotherhood later known as the Order of the Teutonic Knights was born, an institution that began without grand ambitions but would eventually become a military and political power in northern Europe. Its origins date back to the Siege of Acre in 1190, when a group of German crusaders, driven by the hardship and disease afflicting German soldiers, decided to establish a small makeshift hospital under a canvas tent. It was neither a military order, nor a political project, nor an organized force. It was an act of charity amid chaos. Sources describe how these Germans used ship candles as a roof and torn cloths as walls, caring for the wounded and sick who could not communicate with Latin or French healers. The language barrier was decisive. German pilgrims needed a place where they could be treated by people who spoke their language. This gesture caught the attention of the Crusader leaders, who saw in the Brotherhood an organization that could integrate into the complex institutional fabric of the Holy Land. Unlike the Hospitallers, already established and professionalized, these Germans maintained a more flexible and fraternal structure. However, the sanitary situation in Acre during the siege was so critical that any initiative of care was welcome. The fall of the city in 1191 to the forces of Richard the Lionheart and Philip II of France consolidated that small hospital. With the arrival of reinforcements and the reorganization of the Christian presence in the region, the Brotherhood received official recognition from Pope Celestine III in 1192. From that moment on, the German Hospital of St. Mary of Jerusalem acquired an institutional character that allowed it to receive donations, manage property, and expand its work. Initially, its mission was purely hospital-based. Its members were unarmed, did not wear military habit, and had no enemies beyond disease. Its symbol, a black cross on a white background, reflected sobriety and discipline, but did not yet evoke the image of warriors. They were caretakers of weakened bodies in a land where hospitals served as both shelters and centers of charity for devout pilgrims. However, the dynamics of the Holy Land at that time made it almost impossible to separate the religious from the military. The example of the Hospitallers, and above all the Templars, showed that orders capable of combining devotion with armed strength played a decisive role in defending Christian territories. The German leaders who ran the hospital began to understand that the Brotherhood's survival depended on a similar transformation. Pressure also came from the German Crusaders themselves. Many knights of the Holy Roman Empire, accustomed to hierarchical war structures, saw in the Brotherhood an opportunity to create an order representing specifically German-speaking peoples. Templar fervor inspired more than devotion. It inspired a desire for autonomy. Thus, in 1198, the Brotherhood decided to officially become a military and hospital order, following the model of the major orders present in the region. Pope Innocent III approved the militarization of the institution and granted it legal status within the complex Crusader framework. From then on, the Teutonic Order adopted a tripartite model: armed knights, priests administering the sacraments, and brother servants in charge of hospital duties. This combination would form the basis of its operation for centuries. A profound change then occurred. The makeshift hospital became a disciplined organization with vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience, and with an ideal of life blending compassion with holy war. Acre was a crucible of ambitions and tensions where each group sought its place. The Teutonic Knights, thanks to financial support from German nobles, began acquiring property in the Holy Land and Europe. Their ties to the Hohenstaufen imperial family strengthened their prestige. Frederick II, in particular, saw them as a useful instrument for his projects. From the turn of the century, the order began to actively participate in military campaigns. Its knights fought in skirmishes against the Ayyubids and supported strategic fortifications. Nevertheless, its role never reached the military prominence of the Templars or the Hospitallers. Its numbers were smaller, its structure younger, and its support network still limited. The Holy Land was a theater where every decision had to be made quickly, and survival demanded constant adaptation. The strategic situation of the Christians worsened during the first decades of the 13th century. Defeats, lack of unity, and disputes among Christian kings weakened the Crusader position. The Teutonic Order, seeing the future of the Holy Land grow uncertain, began to look toward Europe. There, new military and spiritual needs arose, especially in regions where Christianization had not yet been completed. The idea that a military order could serve not only to defend the Holy Land, but also to expand the faith in pagan territories, began to gain traction. This shift would be decisive. From that moment, the Teutonic Order would cease to be solely an institution born in the Eastern Mediterranean and would become a territorial power in the Baltic. The hospital in Acre would endure for a while longer, but the center of gravity shifted north. Another significant milestone came in 1226 when Emperor Frederick II granted the order the Golden Bull of Rimini, formally authorizing the Teutonic Knights to conquer and govern pagan territories in Eastern Europe. That document sealed the fate of the order and opened the path to a new world of battles, castles, and territorial dominion. The structure, rules, and hierarchy of the order. The transformation of the old hospital of Acre into a military order required more than weapons and knights. It demanded an internal structure capable of sustaining discipline, obedience, and cohesion amid prolonged campaigns, hostile territories, and complex political decisions. At the beginning of the 13th century, the Teutonic Order consolidated as a rigorously organized institution where each member occupied a defined place in a hierarchy designed to maintain military efficiency and spiritual purity. Its organization combined monastic, military, and administrative elements, creating a system unique among the Crusader orders. At the top of this structure was the Grand Master, Hochmeister, a figure vested with almost absolute authority. Elected for life by a general chapter of professed brothers, the Grand Master not only directed campaigns and approved military decisions, but also administered assets, supervised castles, and maintained diplomatic ties with kings, popes, and princes. His power was both symbolic and practical. He represented the order before Christendom, but also personally oversaw internal discipline. Although he was expected to act following the chapter's advice, his word could influence the fate of entire regions. Beneath him were the provincial masters, responsible for specific regions within and outside the Holy Land. Among them stood out the Master of Germany and the Master of Livonia, key figures when the order expanded toward the Baltic. Under their command, military units, economic resources, castles, and Christianized communities were coordinated. The system operated with a monastic logic. Each region was a house of the order, integrated into a larger whole that answered to a central authority. Internal life was regulated by a rule inspired by the Hospitallers and Cistercians, but adapted to the needs of a German military order. The vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience were not symbolic. A brother entering the order renounced his personal property, his future family life, and any ambition outside the service of the order. Obedience was unquestioned. A knight had to follow higher orders even if they involved fatal risks. The order was divided into three main groups. The Teutonic Knights were nobles by birth, armed and trained for war. They lived in community, wore the white habit with the black cross, and fought mounted on war horses. They formed the military and moral elite of the institution. They could not marry, own property, or leave the order without the Grand Master's permission. Brother priests were responsible for the sacraments, liturgy, pre-battle masses, and spiritual administration. Their presence ensured that every military act could be imbued with religious meaning. They also acted as scribes, notaries, and diplomats when necessary. Brother servants were not of the nobility and carried out logistical, craft, or administrative functions. They could fight, but almost always as infantry. Their work was essential for the daily functioning of castles, hospitals, workshops, and convoys. To these were added sergeants, servants, peasants attached to the order, and over time, German settlers who strengthened territorial administration. Although not all were part of the monastic institution, they depended on it and contributed to Teutonic power. Discipline was strict. Knights had to pray several times a day, participate in communal meals, and follow training sessions that included weapons, handling, riding, and endurance exercises. Daily life unfolded between monastic austerity and preparation for war. Gambling, ostentatious luxuries, and any form of improper conduct were prohibited. Infractions could be punished with penances, prolonged fasting, forced labor, or expulsion. The order's aesthetic reinforced its identity. Its white habit symbolized purity, while the black cross served as a constant reminder of its mission to serve Christ in battle and in hospital service. The castles where they lived were not simple fortresses. They were also monasteries with internal chapels, refectories, and communal dormitories. Architecture reflected their values: solidity, simplicity, and order. Obedience constituted the fundamental pillar. A knight had to obey even against his personal judgment. War demanded absolute cohesion, and the order believed that spiritual discipline guaranteed military discipline. The Grand Master could order campaigns, redistribute assets, change commanders, or reorganize entire regions without prior papal approval. This autonomy was key to its later growth. Another central element of the order was its economic system. Although members professed individual poverty, the institution accumulated enormous collective wealth. They owned lands, villages, toll rights, mills, presses, workshops, and ports. Donations from German kings and European princes strengthened their economic power. The order administered these properties with near businesslike efficiency, which allowed it to sustain armies, build fortresses, and finance prolonged campaigns. The hierarchy was reinforced through internal chapters, formal meetings where decisions were made regarding discipline, conflicts, resource allocation, and election of local offices. These assemblies took place in a solemn atmosphere, with biblical readings and rituals reminding the brothers that all decisions had to serve the divine mission. Military training was another essential component. Knights learned to fight as disciplined units, with heavy cavalry tactics adapted to variable terrain. They always fought in close formation, following a banner that combined Christian symbols with the Teutonic Black Cross. The idea was to project strength, order, and cohesion against pagan or Muslim enemies. Infantry, formed by brother servants and local recruits, complemented the cavalry with crossbows, spears, and shields. Over time, this hierarchical structure became too sophisticated for the limited scenario of the Holy Land, where the order had less influence than its older rivals. Therefore, attention toward Eastern Europe became almost inevitable. The order needed lands where it could fully deploy its organization, discipline, and military potential. The East offered something the Holy Land could no longer guarantee: space to build its own state. The last event marking this phase occurred when the chapter of the order, after evaluating the strategic situation of Acre, decided to prioritize expansion into pagan regions of the Baltic. With that internal resolution, the Teutonic structure was ready for a journey that would transform its identity: the relocation of the order to Eastern Europe. At the beginning of the 13th century, the political balance of Eastern Europe was fragile and turbulent. Poland, divided into multiple principalities governed by different branches of the Piast dynasty, suffered constant attacks from pagan peoples resisting Christian expansion. Among these peoples, the Prussians stood out for their ferocity. Coming from the region between the Vistula and the Baltic, they practiced an ancient paganism and defended their villages, sanctuaries, and sacred forests with determination. Their raids and pillages regularly extended into Mazovia, devastating villages and forcing Polish princes to seek external military aid. It was in this context that Conrad of Mazovia, a Piast prince, realized that his forces were insufficient to subdue or pacify the Prussians. For years he had attempted largely unsuccessful campaigns. Every time he entered Prussian territory, he encountered fierce resistance, skillfully planned ambushes, and an intimate knowledge of the terrain that put the Polish knights at a disadvantage. On retreat, Prussian reprisals struck Mazovia. Villages were burned, peasants captured, and trade routes disrupted. Conrad needed an ally with discipline, organization, and resources. Meanwhile, in the Holy Land, the Teutonic Order faced a different challenge. Acre remained a crucial stronghold, but the Christian presence in the region weakened every year. Trade routes between Europe and the Levant declined, military support from European kingdoms was irregular, and internal conflicts among Christian princes made effective defense nearly impossible. The Teutonic horizon in the Mediterranean seemed increasingly limited. The order sought a territory where it could exercise full sovereignty, organize campaigns, and manage resources without depending on the will of foreign kings. The entry into Eastern Europe began when Conrad sent a direct proposal to the order. If the Teutonic Knights agreed to fight the Prussians and defend Mazovia, he would grant them Chelmno, Kulm, and the right to colonize the conquered lands. For Conrad, this was a desperate gamble. For the order, a unique opportunity. However, before acting, the Teutonic Knights demanded guarantees. They were not looking to serve simply as mercenaries. They wanted political authority, legal autonomy, and international recognition of their future sovereignty. A decisive event then occurred. In 1226, Emperor Frederick II, a traditional ally of the order and defender of its prestige, issued the Golden Bull of Rimini, a document granting the Teutonic Knights the imperial right to conquer and govern all lands taken from the Prussians. Essentially, Frederick recognized that Prussian territory would fall under the direct jurisdiction of the Order, not Poland. This imperial support was crucial for the Teutonic Knights to accept Conrad's proposal. The Order initially sent small contingents to Mazovia to assess the situation. Those first incursions showed that the conflict with the Prussians would not be simple. The Prussians had no castles but mastered guerrilla warfare. They ambushed columns, cut supplies, disappeared into swamps, and reappeared in unexpected locations. However, Teutonic discipline, heavy cavalry, and advanced logistical organization gradually changed the military dynamics of the region. A key step was the construction of fortifications on the borders of Prussian territory. The wooden castle of Vogelsang served as an initial base to launch deeper campaigns. This was followed by the construction of Torun and Chełmno, which became central hubs for Teutonic expansion. Each conquest was immediately consolidated with a castle, each castle surrounded by German settlers, and each colony transformed into an economic control point. The method was slow but relentless. For the Order, the move eastward required internal reorganization. The provincial master of Germany played a central role in logistics, sending knights, weapons, and supplies to the eastern frontier. German populations, attracted by the promise of fertile lands and autonomy, began migrating to the new regions. This marked the beginning of a systematic colonization process, later known as the Ostsiedlung, which would irreversibly transform the ethnic and cultural map of the Baltic. As the Order achieved victories, its presence became more ambitious. Conrad of Mazovia soon began to distrust his allies. He had envisioned the Teutonic Knights as a temporary force, but they operated as sovereigns, not vassals. When he attempted to assert his authority over Chełmno, the Teutonic Knights immediately invoked the Golden Bull of Rimini. The conflict between the Order and its former benefactor marked the first signs of tension between the Polish princes and the Knights of the Black Cross, a rivalry that would define the following centuries. The definitive relocation of the Order occurred when its leadership accepted that the future was no longer in Acre. Prussian castles represented stability, expansion, and autonomy. The Order moved resources, brothers, and strategists northward, making Chełmno a sort of provisional capital. There, Teutonic military architecture reached a new scale. Red brick castles, tall towers, reinforced walls, and complex administrative systems quickly took shape. The internal organization of life also adapted to the new environment. Unlike in the Holy Land, where they depended on shifting alliances, in Eastern Europe they could impose their own order, strict regulations, collection of tributes, allocation of lands to German settlers, establishment of parishes, and creation of secure trade routes. The Order, which had been born to care for the sick and defend foreign fortresses, began exercising full territorial sovereignty. Later, the Order decided to replace local authority with its own provincial system. The region of Prussia officially became Teutonic territory, administered by a marshal, a commander, and a complete hierarchical structure dedicated to warfare and evangelization. The conquest and forced conversion of the pagan Prussians. When the Teutonic Order consolidated its first positions in Chełmno and Torun, it realized that it faced one of the most complex challenges of its existence, subjugating the pagan Prussians, a collection of tribal clans deeply attached to their sacred forests, ancestral gods, and a style of warfare as unpredictable as it was fierce. The confrontation would not be purely military, it would also be cultural, spiritual, and territorial, redefining the Baltic landscape for generations. The Prussians were not a unified people under centralized leadership. They were a series of tribes, the Pogosanians, Natangians, Sambians, Bartians, Sudovians, among others, with power structures based on noble families, warrior chiefs, and local priests who safeguarded rituals linked to fire, totemic animals, and sacred woods. This fragmentation complicated both coordinated defense and decisive defeat. Each tribe resisted in its own way, and when one seemed subdued, another would rise in its place. The order began the conquest with periodic campaigns launched each spring when roads became passable and horses could move more swiftly. Their tactics combined heavy cavalry with infantry contingents armed with crossbows, supported by settlers maintaining supply routes. For each advance, the Teutonic Knights followed a methodical pattern. Attack a Prussian region, destroy its fortified wooden villages, known as Grodai, capture its leaders, and immediately erect their own castle in its place. The castles were not mere fortifications. They were administrative centers from which tributes were collected, Teutonic law was enforced, and the Christianization of the local population was overseen. Once a fortress was established, German settlers arrived to found villages, build mills, cultivate fields, and gradually replace the Prussian social organization. It was a territorial transformation as profound as it was irreversible. Despite the Teutonic military discipline, the Prussians proved formidable warriors. Ambushes in dense forests, night attacks, and sabotage of bridges and supply depots wore down the Crusaders. The Teutonic Knights responded with increasingly large campaigns, supported by German nobles and invited knights from across Europe who saw the Prussian crusade as a way to gain spiritual prestige. For many knights, fighting the northern pagans held the same value as fighting Muslims in the Holy Land. The conflict reached a new level when the Prussians began uniting under charismatic leaders capable of coordinating multiple tribes. One of the most famous was Hercus Monte, a young Prussian sent to Germany as a hostage and educated in German culture. He learned cavalry tactics, battle strategies, and the German language, knowledge he later used to organize large-scale rebellions. His leadership was crucial during the Great Prussian Uprising of 1260, a massive revolt that threatened the entire Teutonic project in the region. The rebellion erupted after the Teutonic defeat at the Battle of Grunwald in Livonia, when the Prussians perceived that the order was not invincible. For years, Teutonic castles were besieged, burned, or isolated. German settlers fled westward, and the order lost much of the conquered territory. Hercus Monte led campaigns that destroyed garrisons, captured commanders, and instilled fear along Teutonic lines. For more than a decade, the survival of the order in Prussia was at stake. The order responded with severity. It requested massive aid from the Holy Roman Empire and organized seasonal crusades involving knights from all over Central Europe. Each winter, when rivers froze and the terrain allowed troops to move more easily, the Teutonic Knights launched devastating attacks against rebel centers. The Prussian uprising was finally crushed by the late 1270s. Hercus Monte was captured and executed, his body displayed as a warning to any tribes still considering resistance. With the rebellion ended, the order resumed its original strategy, consolidating each conquest with a castle and Christianizing the region. The Prussians were forced to accept baptism under threat of death or expulsion. Teutonic priests founded parishes, destroyed pagan sanctuaries, and prohibited traditional rituals. Indigenous religious practices were persecuted, and Prussian spiritual leaders were executed or exiled. Though the conversion was officially spiritual, in practice it was involuntary and, in many cases, brutal. German colonization then proceeded at a more stable pace. Numerous cities based on Magdeburg law were founded, such as Elbląg and Königsberg, which became prosperous urban centers. German architecture, language, agriculture, and social organization completely transformed the territory. Prussia ceased to be a tribal land and became a monastic military state with a highly centralized administration. Forced conversion also caused deep demographic changes. Many Prussians were deported, others fled to Lithuania, where paganism still persisted. Those who remained were integrated as serfs, low-ranking soldiers, or tributaries. Over time, the original Prussian identity was diluted, absorbed into German culture. When the order officially declared the complete submission of the Prussians by the end of the 13th century, Prussia became the permanent base of the Teutonic state, a territory no longer dependent on the approval of kings or popes, but on the autonomous power of the order. The construction of the Teutonic monastic state. When Prussian resistance was finally crushed and the Teutonic castles were consolidated as firm points in the landscape, the order realized that it was no longer merely a crusading military force. Something more ambitious was emerging in the region, a sovereign monastic state, organized with a political efficiency few medieval institutions could match. On the ruins of destroyed villages and in territories that had once been only pagan forests, the Teutonic Knights began constructing their own administrative system based on monastic discipline, military engineering, and a clear expansionist purpose. The conquered territory was divided into commanderies, administrative units led by a komtur or commander. Each commandery functioned as a mixture of fortress, monastery, and local government center. The commander administered taxes, oversaw justice, organized troops, controlled trade routes, and ensured the Christianization of the population. His authority was absolute within his region, always subordinate to the Grand Master, who stood at the top of a hierarchy as centralized as it was rigid. The backbone of the Teutonic state was its network of castles. Initially built in wood and later replaced by imposing red brick structures, these castles served not only defensive purposes, but also symbolized the new order imposed on the territory. Each castle featured inner walls, enclosed courtyards, watchtowers, storage rooms, forges, granaries, chapels, and chapter halls. Their design was intended to withstand long sieges and to serve as military organization centers from which troops could be mobilized for new campaigns. Teutonic architecture acquired distinctive features: large complexes with multiple levels, elevated corridors, austere rooms, and an aesthetic of disciplined sobriety. The abundant brick in the region enabled the development of a characteristic style later known as Baltic Gothic. The castles and towns founded by the Order became outstanding examples of this architecture, which still marks the identity of Northern Europe today. Alongside physical construction, the Order designed a complex fiscal system. Subjugated Prussian peasants had to deliver tributes in the form of grain, livestock, furs, or labor. German settlers received land under urban or rural laws that favored economic stability. They could establish workshops, markets, and mills as long as they paid their tributes. This process encouraged migration from German territories, accelerating the Germanization of the Baltic. The Teutonic economy also prospered thanks to the control of strategic trade routes. The Baltic became one of the most dynamic regions of medieval commerce, with key products such as amber, timber, furs, iron, salt, and fish. The Order quickly understood that wealth sustained warfare as much as faith and organized its territories to maximize revenue. It built roads, collected tolls, protected ports, and signed agreements with the Hanseatic League, further strengthening its regional position. One of the most significant political innovations was the creation of a legal system of its own. The Order applied rigorous justice, based on both Germanic tradition and internal regulations. Crimes could be punished with fines, confiscations, corporal punishment, or, in the most severe cases, expulsion. The administration of justice was a political tool. It allowed the Order to control the local population and maintain order in a constantly expanding territory. The social structure within the Teutonic state was strict and hierarchical. At the top were the Knight brothers, who acted as the ruling and military class. Below them were the brother servants, clerics, and administrative officials. Beneath them, the German settlers, and at the lowest level, the assimilated Prussian population turned into dependent peasants. This organization ensured the supremacy of the Order and minimized the possibility of large-scale rebellion like the one that had occurred decades earlier. Demographic growth was another pillar of the state. The Teutonic Knights actively encouraged the founding of cities that would function as commercial and administrative centers. Among them emerged hubs such as Elbing, Thorn, and Königsberg, each with its castle, central market, walls, and ports. These cities followed German legal models, primarily Magdeburg law, ensuring efficient urban functioning and attractiveness to European merchants. Teutonic power also manifested in its capacity to attract temporary crusaders. Each year, knights from Germany, Bohemia, France, and even England traveled to the Baltic to fight against peoples considered infidels. These campaigns, known as Reisen, strengthened the military economy of the state and kept its crusading identity alive. Although many of these knights returned to their homelands, some were impressed by Teutonic organization and joined the Order or became settlers. Diplomacy accompanied internal expansion. The Order maintained complex relations with the papacy, the Holy Roman Empire, and neighboring kingdoms. It knew how to negotiate privileges, request bulls legitimizing its conquests, and mediate conflicts in Western Europe to ensure continuous support. The papacy, for its part, viewed the Teutonic state as a firm bastion against paganism in northeastern Europe. By the end of the 13th century, the monastic state was fully consolidated. Its administrative systems functioned efficiently, its castles dominated the landscape, its cities flourished, and its armies were feared by enemies and respected by allies. Prussia was no longer a collection of pagan tribes. It was an orderly, Germanized territory deeply marked by Teutonic presence. The final transition to fully realized state power was reflected in the election of Grand Master Siegfried von Feuchtwangen as the principal authority, who formally moved the Order's administrative center to the region, establishing a strategic directive that confirmed the Baltic as the true heart of Teutonic power. The great fortresses of the Order, Marienburg and other strongholds. In the heart of the Teutonic state, where rivers intersected with trade routes and plains gave way to dense forests, the most emblematic fortresses of the medieval Baltic began to rise. No crusading order built a system of architecture as vast and uniform as the Teutonic Order. Its network of castles was not simply a chain of defenses, it formed the political, administrative, and military backbone of the monastic state. Among them, one stood as the absolute symbol of its power, Marienburg, the citadel that would become one of the largest brick Gothic fortresses in the world. Construction of Marienburg began in the mid-13th century when the Order decided to establish a seat that reflected its growing authority. Strategically located on the Nogat River, the fortress commanded the routes to the Vistula and access to the Baltic Sea. The Teutonic Knights sought an administrative center, a military headquarters, a monastery, and a political symbol all in one place. The result was a monumental structure built in multiple phases, whose size increased over more than a century. The first phase was the lower house, a walled structure housing workshops, storerooms, stables, kitchens, ovens, forges, and servant quarters. This level accommodated the daily life of hundreds of people. From artisans to low-ranking soldiers, it was a space of constant movement, carts arriving with supplies, blacksmiths hammering iron, cooks preparing meals for entire contingents of warriors, messengers coming and going to various Teutonic castles. The second phase, the middle house, was intended for administration. It contained the main armory, accounting offices, tribute storage, the provincial chapter hall, and the commander's quarters. The daily flow of documents, chests, and weaponry was constant. The Order kept meticulous records of taxes, agricultural production, commercial shipments, and military operations. The functioning of the Teutonic state depended on this bureaucratic center. Finally, the upper house represented the spiritual and political heart of the fortress. It housed the professed knights and, in later years, the Grand Masters themselves. Its walls contained the main refectory, monastic dormitories, and the renowned Hall of the Knights, an elevated vaulted room adorned with brick pillars reflecting the solemnity of the Order. The fortress church, dedicated to the Virgin Mary, patroness of the Order, was also located there. Spirituality, discipline, and authority were united under one roof. Marienburg was more than a castle. It was a city unto itself. Its outer walls, reinforced by square towers and fortified gates, could withstand prolonged sieges. It contained internal wells, massive storerooms, and communication tunnels that allowed defenders to resist even when the castle was completely surrounded. For the Teutonic Knights, Marienburg represented the security of a state that saw itself as a divine fortress on the frontier of the Christian world. But Teutonic grandeur was not limited to a single construction. The Order built a system of castles forming an exceptional defensive network. Königsberg, Elbing, Ragnit, Balga, Torun, Brandenburg, Memel, and many other fortresses, all connected by routes carefully designed to facilitate the movement of troops and supplies. Each castle had specific functions. Some controlled rivers, others monitored borders, and several served as starting points for annual campaigns against Lithuanians, Samogitians, or resistant Baltic tribes. Brick was the material of choice for most constructions due to the scarcity of stone in the region. This gave rise to the aforementioned Baltic Gothic, a distinctive architectural style combining military functionality with geometric elegance. Pointed arches, narrow windows, brick vaults, and walls alternating color patterns. Many castles included large cloisters, vaulted refectories, enormous granaries, and residential towers reflecting both monastic austerity and defensive necessity. The engineering behind these constructions was advanced. The Teutonic Knights perfected drainage techniques to prevent brick erosion in marshy areas and developed reinforced foundations on wet terrain. They also introduced innovations in the use of buttresses, internal passages, and openings for crossbows. The combination of engineering and discipline allowed many of these castles to withstand sieges that would have destroyed less elaborate fortresses. The stability of the state depended on this network. Each castle was a control point from which tributes were collected and campaigns organized. Settlers clustered around these fortresses, forming villages and towns that grew under the protection of Teutonic walls. The order granted urban privileges to attract merchants, turning its strongholds into both military centers and economic engines. When Grandmaster Siegfried von Feuchtwangen officially moved the Order's headquarters from Venice to Marienburg, the castle reached an unprecedented symbolic status. From there, campaigns were planned, treaties signed, ambassadors from across Europe received, and general chapters held that determined the fate of the monastic state. The fortress became a diplomatic center where alliances were discussed, privileges negotiated, and strategies designed that influenced the entire Baltic region. The fortresses were also the stage for the daily rituals of Teutonic life. Each morning, knights gathered to pray before receiving orders from the commander. During winter campaigns, the castles became meeting points for crusaders arriving from Germany, Bohemia, or France. The sounds of weapons being checked, horses shod, and provisions stored marked the rhythm of the state. By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, this network of fortresses constituted one of the most sophisticated military systems in Northern Europe. The power of the order was expressed through bricks, walls, towers, and cloisters, projecting the duality of its identity: monks dedicated to vows and warriors consecrated to expansion. Relations with Poland and Lithuania. When the Teutonic monastic state reached full territorial and administrative consolidation, its fate became irrevocably tied to the politics of northeastern Europe. No crusading order had created such a domain, but that power could not exist in isolation. Relations with its neighbors, particularly Poland and Lithuania, shaped every stage of its rise and later determined the path toward its decline. What began as cooperation evolved into rivalries, border disputes, wars, and fragile alliances on an increasingly tense political chessboard. With Poland, the initial relationship had been ambiguous from the start. Prince Conrad of Mazovia had invited the order to his lands to fight the Prussians, but he soon realized that the Knights' presence was not temporary. When the Teutonic Knights invoked the Golden Bull of Rimini and established absolute sovereignty over Chelmno, the relationship turned sour. Poland, fragmented into various Piast principalities, lacked the unified strength to expel them, yet it retained a political memory. The order had settled there with Polish permission, a fact that became a central argument in future claims. As the order expanded its domains north and west, the Polish princes watched with concern as Teutonic castles encroached on regions they considered their own. Tensions escalated when the order annexed Pomerelia, including the influential city of Gdansk in the early 14th century. According to the Poles, the region historically belonged to the Crown of Poland. According to the Teutonic Knights, control was legitimate by right of conquest and strategic necessity to secure a corridor to the sea. This conflict led to a series of diplomatic disputes, papal judgments, and open hostilities. On several occasions, the papacy attempted to mediate between Poland and the order, but tensions were never fully resolved. Each papal ruling, treaty, or arbitration became a new point of friction. Meanwhile, the order strengthened its castles in Pomerelia, reorganized towns under German law, and secured its trade routes to the Baltic. If Poland represented a political and territorial challenge, Lithuania posed a different kind of threat. A vast pagan state, militarily powerful, and with a flexible structure capable of resisting incursions and launching deep raids into Prussian territory. For the Teutonic Order, Lithuania was the last pagan stronghold in Europe, and defeating it became both a spiritual and military mission. For decades, the Order justified its expansion and dominion as part of an uninterrupted crusade against the Lithuanians, Samogitians, and Yotvingians. Campaigns against Lithuania, known as Rysen, became a unique military phenomenon in the Baltic. Each winter, when frozen rivers allowed the advance of heavy cavalry, the Order summoned crusaders from across Europe. German, French, English, Bohemian, and even Scandinavian knights traveled to Prussia to participate in these expeditions, considered equivalent to crusades in the Holy Land. The Baltic became a stage where European politics temporarily converged to face a common enemy. But Lithuania was no passive state. Its dukes, supported by Samogitian tribes and noble warriors, employed mobile warfare tactics. They avoided direct confrontation with crusader columns, preferring to attack rearguards, ambush convoys, and destroy newly built castles. Their knowledge of the terrain was decisive. Swamps, dense forests, and wide rivers turned the region into a labyrinth where Teutonic tactics lost effectiveness. The rivalry between the two powers reached increasingly violent levels. The Order repeatedly attacked Vilnius, the Lithuanian capital, without success. The Lithuanians responded with deep raids into Prussia, setting fire to castles and villages. The war was permanent, marked by cycles of destruction and reconstruction. However, the situation took an unexpected turn at the end of the 14th century, when Lithuania, pressured by enemies to the east and by the Order itself, made a strategic decision that would change European history. In 1386, Grand Duke Jogaila converted to Christianity, took the name Władysław II Jagiełło, and married the young Polish Queen Hedwig, officially uniting Lithuania with Poland. This event completely transformed the political balance of the Baltic. The Order, which for decades had justified its campaigns as a crusade against paganism, suddenly faced a Christian Lithuanian state allied with its historical rival Poland. The impact of this dynastic union was immediate. Poland and Lithuania combined their military resources, trade routes, and diplomatic influence. The alliance created a continental power capable of directly challenging the Teutonic Order. Meanwhile, the Order insisted that Jogaila's conversion was insincere and that the Lithuanians continued to practice pagan rituals in secret, using this claim to justify new campaigns. But conditions had changed. Every Teutonic attack on Lithuania was now perceived as an attack on Poland, and each border conflict escalated into larger confrontations. Teutonic castles in Prussia and Pomerelia became strategic targets in a region where borders were increasingly fragile. The Order continued reinforcing Marienburg and constructing new fortifications, aware that the military balance was beginning to tilt. The Christianization of the Baltic. As the Teutonic state grew and consolidated its dominion over Prussia, the Christianization of the Baltic advanced as an intertwined political, religious, and military project. The Teutonic Order did not act alone. It shared the stage with missionary bishops sent by Rome, the Livonian Order of the Sword, and the complex network of Baltic peoples who, despite external pressures, maintained deeply rooted ancestral traditions. Religious conversion was not uniform. In some areas, it emerged through negotiated agreements. In others, it was imposed directly by the sword. In every case, however, it permanently transformed the region. The Baltic was a mosaic of distinct tribes: Prussians, Samogitians, Latgalians, Curonians, Estonians, Finns, Lithuanians, and others, each maintaining belief systems rooted in nature, forest spirits, fire deities, and warrior gods. Their rituals included animal sacrifices, communal ceremonies, and seasonal celebrations, dating back to immemorial times. Each sacred forest, ritual hill, and spiritually significant river represented a barrier to Christian expansion. For these peoples, embracing the new faith meant abandoning not only their rituals but also their connection to the land. The Teutonic Order understood that conversion could not rely solely on military campaigns. Although force was the initial method, the permanence of Christianity required an institutional framework: dioceses, parishes, churches, and bishoprics to ensure continuity of Teutonic cultural dominion. The papacy supported this policy by establishing bishoprics in conquered territories, and the Order worked closely with them, always ensuring that its own authority remained paramount. In Prussia, Teutonic castles functioned as centers of religious power. From their chapels, priest brothers supervised mass baptisms and compulsory catechism. Forced conversion was common practice. Entire villages were summoned to town squares or castle gates to receive baptism under threat of exile, confiscation of property, or corporal punishment. Priests, accompanied by military contingents, destroyed pagan sanctuaries, burned idols, and erected churches on sites formerly used for indigenous rituals. The message was clear. The new spiritual order was inseparably linked to the new political order. In regions such as Samogitia, where resistance was fierce, Christianization became a cyclical process. Teutonic campaigns destroyed villages, imposed baptisms, and established garrisons, but when the knights departed, the Samogitians returned to their ancestral rites. The order had to employ a combination of violence and administrative strategy, repopulating territories with German settlers and reinforcing castles to prevent local populations from reclaiming control. The situation changed dramatically in Livonia, where the Order of the Brothers of the Sword, founded in 1202, carried out the most aggressive Christianization in northern Europe. Inspired by the Templars but dedicated exclusively to the Baltic, this order fought against Livonians, Semigallians, and Curonians. Their advance was brutal, and although they succeeded in converting large territories, they also provoked massive uprisings that threatened their existence. After the Brothers of the Sword were defeated in 1236 at the Battle of Saul, the papacy ordered their integration into the Teutonic Order, creating the Livonian Teutonic Order, which operated as an autonomous province under Teutonic authority. This union produced one of the most powerful crusading structures in the north. The order absorbed castles, lands, and men from the Brothers of the Sword and began applying its administrative model in Livonia. Christianization then progressed at a more stable pace. Bishoprics such as Riga, Dorpat, and Öselvik were founded, turning the region into a bridge between Christian Europe and the pagan world that persisted in Lithuania. However, Christianization in the Baltic was not a linear process. The Samogitians, for example, maintained their religious independence for more than a century, becoming the most resilient pagan core in all of Europe. Their sacred forests and deep connection to traditional rituals caused each Teutonic attempt at evangelization to fail or provoke violent uprisings. The region witnessed countless crusading expeditions, with newly constructed castles sometimes burned within months. Teutonic policy combined spiritual coercion with the construction of a new social infrastructure. Villages were reorganized around churches, tributes included offerings to the clergy, Christian observances replaced pagan festivals. The goal was not only to convert the population, but also to Germanize it and structure local life according to a monastic military order. Baptism was viewed as the first step in transforming inhabitants into obedient subjects within the Teutonic state. Christianization acquired a new meaning at the end of the 14th century, when Lithuania, the last major pagan bastion, finally accepted Christianity under Jogaila in 1386. With this act, the religious justification for the Teutonic Crusades collapsed. The Teutonic Order insisted that Lithuanian conversion was a political facade, arguing that pagan rituals continued in secret, but the rest of Europe began to view their campaigns as wars of territorial expansion rather than spiritual missions. This shift in perception had devastating diplomatic consequences. The papacy no longer supported Teutonic campaigns with the same enthusiasm, and many European knights ceased traveling to the Baltic to join the Ryzen. The order retained a powerful military machine but gradually lost the moral and political support that had sustained its legitimacy for generations. The military expansion of the order in Livonia. When the Teutonic Order absorbed the Brothers of the Sword after their defeat in 1236, Livonia became not only a new military frontier but also a logical extension of the Teutonic project, a strategic territory rich in river routes and located between the Baltic Sea and the deep forests connecting to the Russian world. The region, however, was neither empty nor homogeneous. It was inhabited by Curonians, Semigallians, Livonians, Latgalians, and other peoples who had resisted Christian pressure for decades. For the order, Livonia represented a challenge as complex as Prussia, but also an opportunity to expand its network of castles, increase resources, and project power northward. The integration of the former Brothers of the Sword created a new administrative structure, the Teutonic Livonian province, governed by a landmeister who, although subordinate to the Grand Master, operated with considerable autonomy. This dual level of authority gave the region a distinct character. In Livonia, the order had to balance the interests of local bishoprics, German merchants in Riga, and newly converted Baltic nobles. Internal diplomacy was constant because power did not rest solely on castles but also on maintaining cohesion among territories with diverse identities. The first major Teutonic strategy was to rebuild the military system the Brothers of the Sword had attempted to establish. Previous defeats had left castles destroyed or abandoned, villages devastated, and borders unclear. The Teutonic Order launched a systematic fortification campaign. They built Fellin, reinforced Wenden, consolidated Riga as a commercial center, and constructed a chain of fortresses along the Daugava and Gauja rivers. This secured internal routes, projected forces northward, and blocked any attempts at coordinated rebellion. Livonia also became a military laboratory, where the Order experimented with tactics adapted to terrain even harsher than Prussia's. Forests, swamps, and hills forced the Teutonic Knights to modify heavy cavalry formations and rely more on light infantry, local scouts, and reinforcements sent from Prussia. Each campaign required precise logistics: riverboats to transport supplies, temporary bridges, protected caravans, and garrisons that had to be maintained even during the harsh Baltic winters. The local tribes offered prolonged resistance. The Curonians and Semigallians in particular confronted the Teutonic Knights for decades. Known for their maritime skills and swift raids, the Curonians attacked ports, burned outposts, and withdrew before the Teutonic cavalry could respond. The Semigallians employed guerrilla tactics, using their knowledge of swamps and forests to harass Teutonic columns. The Order responded by burning villages, deporting populations, and establishing increasingly deep castles in enemy territory. A significant episode was the Great Curonian-Semigallian Rebellion of the mid-13th century. Several tribes united to destroy newly built fortresses, besiege garrisons, and cut river routes. For years, the Teutonic Knights struggled to maintain control. Final victory only came when they coordinated campaigns from Prussia with operations in Livonia, attacking the tribes from two fronts. The repression was severe: mass deportations and immediate reconstruction of destroyed castles. These measures allowed the Order to pacify the region and begin administrative integration. Parallel to the military effort, the Order encouraged the arrival of German settlers to strengthen control. The cities of Riga, Dorpat, and Reval grew rapidly, becoming key commercial hubs in the Baltic. The presence of the Hanseatic League was fundamental. Its merchants needed security, ports, and reliable routes, which the Order provided. In return, the Teutonic Knights received income, supplies, and political support. Livonia became a commercial corridor where furs, wax, grain, honey, wood, iron, and German-manufactured goods were traded. Despite its relentless advance, the Order faced an unexpected enemy to the east: the Russian principalities, especially Novgorod and Pskov. These Orthodox states, though Christian, were not aligned with the papacy or the Order. Tensions arose when the Teutonic Knights attempted to extend their influence toward Lake Peipus and beyond, trying to cut Russian trade routes. This culminated in one of the most famous episodes in Baltic history, the Battle on the Ice in 1242, where the forces of Prince Alexander Nevsky defeated the Livonian coalition on the frozen lake. This encounter marked a political and geographical limit. The Teutonic Knights realized that expanding into Russian lands would be extremely costly, both in lives and legitimacy. The papacy, while approving of a crusade against Orthodox Christians, did not want a prolonged conflict that would weaken the Order. Thus, Livonia consolidated as a stable eastern frontier, while the Order focused its efforts on Lithuania, the last large pagan region. Livonia, however, remained a battlefield. Each time the Order advanced against the Lithuanians, it had to secure its rear in Livonia to prevent raids from the north. The Samogitians, occasional allies of the Livonian tribes, attacked castles in the region to distract the Order. Each campaign required coordination between the Prussian and Livonian provinces, demonstrating that the Teutonic state functioned as an interconnected military machine. By the late 14th century, Livonia had been completely transformed. The local tribes had been Christianized, German cities thrived under German urban law, and Teutonic castles dominated the landscape. However, beneath the appearance of stability, growing political tension lingered. The Order's power had reached its peak, but new actors, especially the Polish-Lithuanian Union, were beginning to alter the regional balance. The rise of Teutonic power in Northern Europe. During the 13th and 14th centuries, the Teutonic Order evolved from a regional crusading force into a major political and economic power in Northern Europe. After consolidating Prussia and Livonia, the Order administered a continuous territory with prosperous cities, imposing castles, and trade routes connecting the Baltic Sea with the European interior. Its expansion was not only military but also diplomatic, economic, and symbolic. The Teutonic state became an indispensable actor in European politics, capable of rivaling established kingdoms and attracting both admiration and distrust. The economic growth of the state rested on three pillars: trade, colonization, and organized taxation. Teutonic cities, founded under German law, became dynamic urban centers with orderly streets, powerful guilds, and markets attracting merchants from across the Hanseatic League. Elbląg, Königsberg, Danzig, Riga, Reval, and Dorpat integrated into the Hanseatic network, allowing goods such as grain, amber, timber, iron, and furs to flow through well-administered and secure ports. The Order protected these routes with its Baltic fleet and river garrisons. In return, it received substantial income from taxes, port fees, and trade duties. Amber, in particular, became one of the most valuable resources. From the Baltic coast, the Order controlled its extraction and trade, granting it a monopoly that further enriched its coffers. This economic control enabled the funding of armies, the construction of castles, and the sponsorship of annual campaigns against both pagan and Christian enemies. To many contemporary observers, the Teutonic state appeared as a unique combination of monastic discipline, military organization, and mercantile pragmatism. Teutonic diplomacy also reached a continental scale. The Order maintained embassies at the main European courts, in the Holy Roman Empire, where it frequently received support from emperors, in German kingdoms whose nobles sent sons to serve as knights, in Bohemia, France, and even England, where campaigns against Lithuania had gained prestige comparable to Levantine Crusades. The Teutonic presence in these courts was constant. The Grand Master sent envoys to negotiate privileges, arbitrate conflicts, or secure ongoing donations of lands and goods. Within the monastic state itself, the hierarchical structure reached peak efficiency. Commanders administered castles and regions with strict oversight. The Order's courts ensured justice according to internal regulations. Priest brothers oversaw spiritual life, and professed knights formed a disciplined elite serving as both military guard and ruling class. Everything was geared towards sustaining a single project, maintaining Christian expansion, increasing economic power, and securing lasting dominance over the Baltic region. Yet this rise was not without tensions. The annexation of Pomerelia and the capture of Danzig generated ongoing conflicts with Poland. While the Order sought to justify its actions as necessary for regional stability, the Poles considered them illegitimate usurpations. For decades, both states exchanged accusations, sent ambassadors to Rome, and participated in trials arbitrated by popes or European kings. In practice, these proceedings rarely altered the situation. The Order remained firm in its territories and continued strengthening castles and cities. The situation with Lithuania was even more complex. Despite Jogaila's official conversion in 1386, the Order continued attacking border regions, arguing that paganism persisted among the Samogitians. For the Order, the crusade was not over. For the Polish-Lithuanian alliance, these actions were unjustified aggressions. The clash between the Teutonic crusading world and the new Christian Lithuanian state became inevitable. Internally, growing wealth generated new dynamics. The Teutonic state began issuing its own currency, financing large-scale projects and establishing stable relations with the Hanseatic League, which reinforced its influence over Baltic trade. It even developed a maritime diplomacy. Pirates, such as the Vitalians, initially enemies of the Order, were sometimes fought and sometimes tolerated depending on contemporary political needs. Alliances with Scandinavian kingdoms, especially Denmark, played a crucial role in competing for control of the sea. In parallel, the Order cultivated a powerful propagandistic image. Chronicles such as the Chroniken Terrae Prussiae portrayed its conquests as a divine enterprise, describing the fight against pagans and rebels as missions blessed by God. Ceremonies at Marienburg, chapter meetings, and monastic rituals reinforced the idea that the Teutonic state was more than a military power. It was a spiritual project. By the late 14th century, the Order had reached its zenith. It controlled vast territories, wealthy cities, vital trade routes, and an unrivaled network of castles in northern Europe. The Teutonic fleet patrolled the Baltic, and its armies could mobilize thousands of soldiers in coordinated campaigns. Even major kingdoms had to consider the Teutonic position before planning political action. However, cracks began to appear beneath this splendor. Maintaining a militarized state required constant resources, and tensions with Poland and Lithuania intensified. The Jagiellonian alliance pressed the Teutonic state from the south and east. The Hanseatic League could become an ally or rival depending on its interests, and local German nobles began demanding greater freedoms within the monastic state. Ultimately, accumulated frictions led to inevitable conflict. Border tensions, territorial claims, and mutual suspicion culminated in open war between the Order and the Polish-Lithuanian alliance. The Battle of Grunwald, also known as the Battle of Tannenberg, 1410. The summer of 1410 marked the moment when the Teutonic Order went from being a feared power in northern Europe to a state facing its first major fracture. For decades, it had withstood Baltic rebellions, Lithuanian campaigns, and diplomatic disputes with Poland, but it had never before been threatened by such a solid coalition as the one formed under the leadership of Polish King Władysław II Jagiełło and his cousin, Grand Duke Vytautas of Lithuania. The Polish-Lithuanian alliance, politically strengthened and backed by a wide array of vassals and foreign contingents, was ready to face the Order in a full-scale battle. The Order, under the command of Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen, relied on its military reputation and disciplined heavy cavalry system. Its castles were well supplied, its cities maintained war reserves, and its troops included contingents of German knights, mercenaries, and invited crusaders. For years, Teutonic propaganda had insisted that Lithuania remained secretly pagan and that Poland was deceived in allying with Jogaila. This rhetoric no longer carried much weight in Western Europe, but within the Order it still fueled the belief that they were fighting a just war. The 1410 campaign began with a bold maneuver by the Polish-Lithuanian alliance. Instead of attacking Pomerelia or Livonia, areas defended by numerous castles, Jagiełło and Vytautas deliberately crossed the Vistula to enter central Prussian territory. Their real objective was to besiege Marienburg, the jewel of the Teutonic state. To achieve this, they needed to defeat the Order's main army in open battle. The clash was inevitable. The Order mobilized rapidly, leaving garrisons in cities while concentrating its forces near the villages of Grunwald, Tannenberg, and Ludwigsdorf. The dawn of July 15, 1410, was warm and clear. Chroniclers describe a cloudless sky above the forests and hills surrounding the plains where the two armies would meet. The Polish-Lithuanian alliance deployed its vast force in two main wings. On the left, the Polish troops and their vassals. On the right, the Lithuanian, Ruthenian, Tatar, and Slavic contingents. Vytautas, renowned for his military energy, commanded the Lithuanian wing with a firm hand. Jagiełło, more cautious and methodical, oversaw the battle from a hill, surrounded by his royal guard. The Order formed a compact line of heavy cavalry, with banners from all its commanderies. The Teutonic Knights, clad in their white mantles with black crosses, advanced in formation under the relentless sun. Ulrich von Jungingen positioned his best units in the center, relying on a decisive charge to break the enemy lines. The battle began with an exchange of arrows. Lithuanian and Tatar archers harassed the Teutonic forces, forcing them to advance their cavalry. Then Vytautas executed the first key maneuver. An initial attack meant not to destroy but to provoke. His light cavalry charged and, after a few minutes of combat, feigned a retreat into the forests. The Teutonic Knights took the bait. They pursued the Lithuanians, believing their lines had broken, a tactic Vytautas had used repeatedly against Western enemies. The supposed Lithuanian retreat caused a gap in the Teutonic line. When the German knights pushed too far into the enemy's right flank, the Lithuanians regrouped among the trees, ready to re-enter the fight. This critical moment allowed the Polish forces on the left wing to reorganize their defense before facing the main Teutonic cavalry assault. The Polish center held with difficulty. The Order's knights fought fiercely, toppling banners and pushing the infantry backward. The combat was brutal and hand-to-hand. Contemporary chronicles describe dented armor, horses collapsing in blood-stained mud, and banners tangled amid growing confusion. The main Polish banner fell at a key moment, creating the false impression that Jagiełło had lost control of his army. Yet the king remained calm and sent reinforcements to where the line was breaking. Meanwhile, the pursuit on the Lithuanian flank ended when the Teutonic Knights, exhausted from the initial charge, began to be surrounded. Vytautas launched a fierce counterattack. The Lithuanians returned to the battlefield, striking the exposed flanks of the Teutonic Knights, who, isolated, began to fall under relentless assault. The battle, which at first seemed to favor the Order, began to shift. Ulrich von Jungingen, seeing the danger, decided to commit his final reserve, the most experienced knights accompanied by his personal guard. Clad in ceremonial armor and mounted on a dark horse, he charged directly at Jagiełło's position, attempting to decapitate the Polish leadership in a single blow, but the Polish Royal Guard diverted the attack. The clash was so intense that chroniclers mention how Polish and Teutonic banners became entangled, a symbol of the relentless struggle. Amid the chaos, Ulrich found himself surrounded. His courage was not enough to break the encirclement, and he fell in combat along with the Order's highest dignitaries. With his death, Teutonic morale collapsed. The retreat turned into a rout, and the Polish-Lithuanian alliance took control of the field. The consequences were profound. The Order's main army had been destroyed in a single day. Thousands of knights perished, including much of the Teutonic leadership. The road to Marienburg was left open, and the victorious forces advanced quickly toward the great fortress. However, the castle held out with determination, saving the monastic state from immediate collapse. Even so, the defeat had changed history. The Order would never again regain the military power or prestige it had held before the battle. The decline of the Teutonic state. The defeat at Grunwald-Tannenberg did not immediately destroy the Teutonic state, but it opened a deep fracture in the structure that had sustained its power for over a century. What followed was a slow, complex, and often painful process in which military crises, economic pressures, internal rebellions, and social transformations weakened the Order from both within and without. The castle of Marienburg, which had heroically resisted the siege of 1410, remained a symbol of strength, but its luster began to fade under the weight of the inevitable consequences of defeat. After the battle, the new Grandmaster Heinrich von Plauen managed to reorganize the defenses and save the capital of the state. His efficient leadership during the siege of Marienburg kept the Order cohesive at a critical moment. However, his military success did not translate into political stability. Internal factions began questioning his authority, accusing him of impulsive decisions or acting without proper consultation with the general chapter. His dismissal just a few years later highlighted a clear symptom. The Order no longer possessed the internal solidity that had characterized its periods of expansion. The Treaty of Thorn of 1411, signed to end the war, imposed harsh conditions. The Order had to pay a substantial indemnity to Poland and Lithuania, return strategic territories, and grant a degree of autonomy to disputed regions. The size of the reparations forced the Order to raise taxes in Prussia, generating resentment among the local population, particularly the German burghers of the Hanseatic cities who had prospered under Teutonic administration. What had once been admiration for the discipline of the monastic state began to turn into distrust and discontent. The economy of the Teutonic state, which had thrived on Baltic trade, suffered progressive decline. The cost of maintaining castles, garrisons, and a centralized administration was enormous, and with trade routes becoming less secure due to conflicts and regional tensions, revenues decreased. Competition with Hanseatic cities like Lübeck and with Polish ports strengthened after the victory contributed to the financial crisis. The Order had to resort to loans, sell properties, and increase tolls, measures that further irritated merchants and German settlers. These pressures were compounded by growing conflicts with the Prussian estates, a federation of cities, nobles, and clergy seeking greater autonomy. Many felt that the Order governed with excessive rigidity and that its policies hindered local economic development. Discontent intensified when the Order raised taxes to fund new campaigns against Poland and Lithuania, which over time became less successful. Tensions erupted in 1454 with the Prussian Confederation Rebellion, led by the Prussian Confederation, a coalition of cities and nobles who sought the protection of Polish King Casimir IV Jagiellon. The Order responded with force, triggering the 13 Years' War, a prolonged conflict that further drained its resources. The war became a confrontation between the state that had once dominated the Baltic and the very cities that had previously supported its prosperity. The conflict was disastrous for the Order. Its armies, which had once functioned as disciplined machines, now lacked resources, foreign knights, and financial backing. The Prussian cities, in contrast, received Polish support and could hire mercenaries. Important castles such as Marienburg changed hands. Some sold to Poland after Teutonic garrisons, unable to pay their troops, negotiated their surrender. The Order's greatest symbol was reduced to a Polish stronghold, a severe moral blow. The conflict ended with the Second Treaty of Thorn in 1466, marking a point of no return. The order had to cede western Prussia, including cities such as Danzig, Elbląg and Torun, to the Polish crown. This region came under direct Polish rule, while eastern Prussia became a Polish fief governed by the order but subordinated to the king. Territorial loss and political subordination reduced the order to a minor regional actor. Its project of an independent state in the Baltic had ended. Decline was also evident within the organization itself. Fewer German nobles were willing to join as professed knights. Vocations decreased, discipline relaxed, and the monastic structure showed signs of deterioration. The rigid crusading ideal became anachronistic in a Europe moving toward more centralized and secular forms of power. While kings and dukes strengthened their states, the order remained trapped in a medieval model. Spiritual pressures also increased with the emergence of new religious currents. Lutheranism, which spread rapidly in German territories from 1517 onward, directly impacted the order. Many of its members sympathized with reformist ideas, which clashed with the traditional Catholic identity of the monastic state. The contradiction between its religious foundation and the doctrinal changes sweeping Europe generated deep institutional tensions. Decline reached its final stage when Grand Master Albert of Brandenburg-Ansbach, a member of the Hohenzollern dynasty, concluded that the order could no longer sustain itself as a monastic state. After assessing the political situation, acknowledging Polish hegemony, and accepting the expansion of Protestantism, Albert decided to break with Rome, embrace Lutheran doctrine, and fully secularize the order's territories in 1525. Prussia thus became a hereditary duchy under Polish sovereignty, marking the practical end of the medieval Teutonic state. This act, which dissolved the order's political project, also served as a bridge to a new entity, the Duchy of Prussia, a precursor of the future Kingdom of Prussia, which centuries later would become one of the powers that unified Germany. The secularization of the order and the birth of Prussia. At the beginning of the 16th century, the Teutonic Order found itself trapped in a world that had changed faster than it could adapt. What had been for 3 centuries a powerful, disciplined monastic military structure justified by the crusading ideal now faced centralized states, consolidated monarchies, and new religious doctrines that questioned the very basis of its existence. Secularization was not an accident nor a sudden betrayal of medieval ideals. It was the logical outcome of a historical process that had gradually eroded its foundations. The turning point came with Albert of Brandenburg-Ansbach, elected Grand Master in 1511. Young, ambitious, and acutely aware of the new European political climate, Albert understood that the order could not sustain itself in the precarious balance left after the Second Treaty of Thorn in 1466. He governed a reduced territory, economically weakened and politically subordinate to the Polish crown. His authority was more nominal than effective. Prussian nobles obeyed him only partially, cities conducted trade according to their own interests, and the population was increasingly influenced by reformist ideas spreading across Germany. The Protestant Reformation, initiated by Martin Luther in 1517, swept through the German territories with unexpected speed. Its critiques of ecclesiastical corruption, emphasis on personal faith, and rejection of monastic structures resonated particularly with Teutonic Knights, many of whom were restless nobles chafing under the restrictions of monastic life. Several commanders discreetly sympathized with the new ideas, while others viewed them as a direct threat to the order. The Grand Master, who maintained correspondence with Luther, found himself at the center of this doctrinal turbulence. Tensions reached their peak when Albert traveled to Wittenberg to meet Luther in person. This encounter, one of the decisive moments in the order's history, convinced the Grand Master that it was impossible to sustain the medieval monastic model. Luther recommended a bold solution: transform Prussia into a secular duchy, adopt Lutheranism, and rule as a hereditary prince under Polish sovereignty. By doing so, Albert could stabilize the region and provide it with a modern political structure, albeit at the cost of permanently dissolving the religious military project that had created the Teutonic state. The plan required negotiation with Poland, whose king, Sigismund I the Old, Albert's maternal uncle, had a clear interest in stabilizing the Prussian border and reducing the order's residual power. After intense discussions, a historic agreement was reached. In 1525, Albert performed the Prussian homage in Krakow, kneeling before the Polish king and swearing loyalty as the new Duke of Prussia. This act marked the official disappearance of the monastic state and the complete transformation of its territory into a secular Protestant duchy. Secularization had profound consequences. The professed Teutonic Knights, bound by vows of chastity and poverty, were divided. Some left the order, married, and integrated into the local nobility. Others remained loyal to Catholicism and emigrated to the remaining order territories in the Holy Roman Empire, particularly in Germany, where the institution survived as a religious organization without territorial power. In Prussia, castles that had been military monasteries were transformed into ducal residences, administrative offices, and centers of government. The new Duchy of Prussia marked the beginning of a completely different state-building process. Albert implemented reforms inspired by modern administration. He reorganized tax collection, strengthened Protestant education, secularized ecclesiastical properties, founded schools, and promoted the printing of books in the German language. Under his rule, Prussia definitively abandoned the medieval crusading model and adopted a state identity based on territorial sovereignty and religious reform. A significant symbolic change was the transformation of Königsberg, which became the political and cultural center of the duchy. There, in 1544, Albert founded the University of Königsberg, also known as the Albertina, an academic center that would later exert a decisive influence on German intellectual life. Where armor, monastic prayers, and crusader banners had once dominated, printing presses, classrooms, and theological debates now emerged. The territory ceased to be a military stronghold and became a hub of Protestant intellectual life.